Have you ever seen a dying creature, trembling and calling out ghost, when you never believed such a thing existed? In the early autumn of 1993, in the quiet town of Ballard Hollow, Vermont, a 13-year-old boy named Miles Thatcher stumbled upon a burlap sack deep in the forest of Burnt Cedar Ridge. It twitched, barely. When he opened it, a tiny, trembling hand gripped his wrist, and a voice, fragile, breathless, whispered, "Ma." It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else, something left behind to die. Miles brought it home. His great-grandmother, Hattie, didn't ask what it was. She simply handed him clean cloths and glass bottles and taught him how to care for something without leaving a human scent. Every night, a strange truck crawled slowly past their dirt road. Someone was hunting, watching, waiting for a mistake. That creature was fading fast, and Miles almost took it to the clinic, until he realized that out there it would become evidence, something to be traded for reward money pinned on the town's bulletin board. So he made a choice, to keep it safe. With his own two shaking hands, signals began appearing, stones tapping in the forest, woven grass left beside the stream. A flat rock returned after Miles left food on the fence. Out there, beyond the trees, something was watching, but not with hunger, with understanding. On the first frost night, Hattie burned her own hand to distract a man trying to photograph the evidence. That's how she protected them, but the hunt was too close. Miles fled with the creature into the old potato cellar, found a forgotten wartime tunnel leading to the creek, and at the end of it, something enormous waited. Not to take, not to hurt, but to shield. At dawn, on top of Burnt Cedar Ridge, Miles laid the little being on the damp ground. It pressed its forehead gently to his chest, a silent goodbye, and vanished into the forest. No one was caught. No one was hurt. Only one decision had been made. Miles returned home changed, no longer useless, no longer invisible. He had carried a fading life to safety. That secret, known only to Hattie and the trees, was enough. Because sometimes you don't need the world to see you did the right thing. Sometimes it's enough just to know you did. Now, I'm so curious. Where are you watching this from? How far can this story travel if we share it with the hearts that still believe in unseen wonders? To all of you tuning in, my warmest thank you. If you felt something today, if you believe stories like this deserve a place in the world, give it a like, subscribe, and let's build a community that loves, protects, and believes in Bigfoot. Let's keep these stories alive, together. The first leaves were just starting to turn on Burnt Cedar Ridge, catching the low amber light like small, bruised flames. The air had that dry, crisp edge to it, a trace of cold hiding behind the apple sap scent that drifted through the undergrowth. Somewhere downhill, a creek whispered its way over rocks, slick with moss. But up here on the ridge, it was mostly quiet except for the hush of bracken brushing denim and the rhythm of a boy's steps trying not to sound like running. Miles Thatcher kept his eyes forward and his chin tucked into the collar of his flannel. 13 was a hard age, especially in a place where your last name carried stories older than you were, and your shoes told the town more truth than your mouth ever could. The duct tape on his right sneaker was peeling again, flapping against the toe with every third step. That was why he took the woods instead of the road. The shortcut meant scratched hands, burrs stuck in his socks, and one time a copperhead too close for comfort. But it also meant he didn't have to hear Billy Crane laugh about how the thrift store shoes didn't even match. He stepped over a root, ducked under a low pine limb, and paused near a cluster of ferns where something looked off. It wasn't big, just the wrong kind of shape. An old feed sack, maybe, burlap and stained, curled into itself like it had been dropped in a hurry. But the way it moved, barely but definitely, wasn't the way a sack should move. Miles knelt down, breath caught in his chest, and reached out with slow fingers. The bag was knotted shut with 2 tight loops of frayed twine. He touched the top knot and something inside twitched hard, then went still again. The air thickened. He could hear the dry leaves rattling somewhere upslope, the distant rumble of a truck engine, too slow to be passing through, closer than it should have been. He undid the first knot with fingers that didn't want to obey, then reached for the second, pulling it loose as gently as he could. The fabric loosened, slumped, and from inside came a small sound, thin as thread, hoarse and breathless. Ma? It wasn't a voice that made sense. Not human, not animal. Something in between, high-pitched but weak, like the word didn't belong to language at all, but had broken off someone else's memory and washed up in this sack. A hand reached out next, or something like a hand. Small, trembling, covered in something dark and matted that wasn't fur in the usual sense, but wasn't quite skin either. Fingers curled around his wrist with surprising strength. And that was the moment Miles stopped thinking. He didn't plan to run. He just stood, clutching the whole sagging bundle to his chest, heart slamming in his throat as the engine got louder. Men's voices, not talking loud enough to be casual. That kind of muttering men used when they were planning something they didn't want heard. Miles turned and bolted. Not down the path to home. That would be too direct. He cut left, downhill, letting his boots skid in the loose dirt, heading for the dry creek bed where he could double back and blur his tracks. His breath tore through the trees faster than the wind did. He didn't stop running until the old goat shed came into view, the lopsided structure behind the house that still smelled faintly of straw and rust, though the goats had been gone 2 winters now. He ducked inside, heart pounding, and laid the bundle down in the softest corner he could find. The thing inside the sack didn't move, didn't speak. Just that one hand resting palm up in the straw, ribs lifting in shallow, uneven pulls of breath. Miles backed away slowly, closed the door, wedged the latch with a stick like he used to when he was younger and afraid of coyotes. Then he crept back up the slope to the house, where the porch light was already on, like it always was after sunset. He watched it from the dark for a long time before going inside. Later, long after Hattie had gone to bed and the house was so quiet it made his ears ring, Miles lay awake with his eyes on the ceiling and every breath tuned to the sound of engines. Around 2 a.m. it came, a truck, but not one that was just passing by. Too slow. Tires on dirt, moving like someone was searching. He slipped out of bed, pressed one eye to the edge of the window. Headlights off. Just the whisper of rubber over gravel. Then, another sound. A whistle. Not musical. Not even normal. It was sharp, pulsing, like someone trying to mimic a bird but forgetting the part where birds aren't supposed to make you feel cold. It echoed through the trees. Miles dropped to the floor. He stayed there until the truck finally rolled away. He didn't know how long he'd been holding his breath, only that his chest hurt from the effort of silence. Down in the goat shed, the thing in the sack had started breathing again. Deeper now, like it knew it was safe. Or maybe like it had never stopped being afraid. In the morning, Hattie was already in the kitchen. She didn't look up when he shuffled in, didn't ask why he looked like he hadn't slept. Just kept slicing apples for the drying rack with the same slow, practiced rhythm she used for everything. Miles hovered near the stove. He didn't say anything, just poured a little milk into a saucepan and held the handle tight to stop the shaking. She turned only once, placed a clean sack of flour on the counter, then 2 empty glass bottles next to it. She didn't speak, but something in her eyes, something dry and unblinking, told him she knew. That she'd always known. She went back to her apples without another glance. It was her way of saying, if you brought it home, you're feeding it, but don't you dare speak of it out loud. He took the milk to the goat shed. The figure inside the feed sack had curled in tighter, breath rattling soft. He opened the bag slowly, poured a little milk into his palm. At first, nothing. Then, movement. Lips, if that's what they were, pressed against his hand. Weak, but trying. Trying harder than he'd seen anything try in a long time. When the little body finished drinking, it slumped against the straw. But it was warmer now, and it hadn't let go of his fingers. That night, the cold came in sharper, wind pushing through the cracks in the window frames, making the porch swing creak. From behind the goat shed, down by the edge of the forest, came a sound that didn't belong to the season. A tapping. Stone on stone, not loud, not frantic, just steady. Like someone was knocking on a door that didn't exist. Miles froze in the hallway, his hand on the back door's knob. He crept out, barefoot on the cold wood. The tapping stopped. But in the mud near the gate, something else waited. A boot print, big. Too big for anyone in town, unless they wore hunting gear for no reason. Miles stood staring at it until his spine ached from the cold. Inside, Hattie sat by the stove, a quilt in her lap. She didn't look up, didn't blink. But when he came in, still barefoot, her voice cut through the silence like a knife sliding into oak. "If you keep it," she said, not turning around, "you better be ready to pay for it." And just like that, Miles understood. The thing in the sack wasn't just something he'd rescued. It was a secret with a cost, and now it wasn't just his to carry. It belonged to the ridge, to the people who used to come here before there were names on maps, to the ones who still left messages in the dark, knocking like old gods. He closed the door softly behind him and didn't ask any more questions. The quilt on Hattie's lap never moved, but he knew she hadn't gone back to sleep either. The trees outside pressed closer to the house that night, and the wind no longer smelled like apple. It smelled like stone, and smoke, and something old enough to remember being hunted. The rest of the night passed without sound. But deep in the goat shed, something too small to name curled against a pile of straw and held one warm stone like a prayer. Miles didn't know why it mattered yet, but he would. And the knocking would come again. The morning came slow and gray over Burnt Cedar Ridge, pulling a hush over the treetops like a heavy wool blanket. The kind of quiet that made everything feel suspended, like the forest was holding its breath along with the boy. Miles woke before the sun had fully broken the horizon, lying stiff beneath the faded quilt on his cot, heart still stuck somewhere between the fear of the night before and the secret now waiting out back in the goat shed. He could hear the wind nudging at the cabin walls, the old boards creaking as if remembering something they'd rather forget. In the kitchen, a low clink of ceramic on wood told him Hattie was already up. She always was. But this morning, he moved slower, careful not to draw attention. Every motion, from the way he slipped on his jacket to the way he poured milk into the tin saucepan, was soaked in the weight of what he wasn't saying. He glanced at the back door. The trees looked darker than usual, or maybe it was just the knowing. His hands trembled slightly as he held the pan over the flame, watching the milk warm to just short of a boil. Too hot and it would burn the throat. Too cold and it wouldn't do anything for what lay curled in that old feed sack, hidden under a mound of brittle straw. He didn't speak as he passed Hattie at the table. She didn't look at him either. But just as he reached for the door, she set down the paring knife she'd been using to peel apples and placed something on the counter beside him. A small sack of all-purpose flour, clean and cinched tight, followed by 2 narrow glass bottles, empty and gleaming like they'd just been boiled. She said nothing. Just returned to slicing apples with a kind of stillness that said everything she meant to. That was her way. She wouldn't ask, wouldn't give permission, but she'd already decided. If it had come into this house under his arms, then it wasn't going back out. Not in a way the world would get to keep. Miles picked up the bottles in the sack with both hands, nodded slightly even though she didn't see, and stepped out into the chill. The air bit harder out here. Frost from the night still lingered along the grass where the morning light hadn't touched. He crossed the yard quietly, boots soft on the dirt path, and opened the warped door of the goat shed with care. Inside, the smell was a mix of old hay, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. The bundle hadn't moved much. Whatever was inside that sack, no, whoever, was too weak to even shift position on its own. Miles knelt in the straw, watching for the rise and fall of its chest. It was there, but just barely. He poured the warm milk into his palm and waited. At first, nothing. The face hidden beneath the matted hair didn't turn. The limbs didn't lift. But then, as if the scent or warmth reached past the sleep, the head shifted slightly, and a dry tongue reached forward. It didn't lap like a dog or suck like a baby. It drank, slow, uncertain, and trembling. When the milk dribbled down the corners of its mouth, Miles tried again, tilting his hand gently. This time, the small figure leaned into his touch and drank from his cupped palm without spilling a drop. Something in his chest cracked open, warm and soft, the way it did that one time he found a robin's egg that hadn't yet hatched, cradled in a shoe print. This thing, this child or creature or whatever the world would call it, wasn't just surviving. It was trusting, and that, somehow, felt more dangerous than anything. By mid-morning, the wind shifted again. Miles stood out back behind the shed, scanning the edge of the woods when he heard it. A sound too clean to be natural. A knock, not wood on wood like a falling branch, not the thud of deer hooves. It was precise, rhythmic. Tap, pause, tap. A stone knocking against another, far enough off to sound faint, but close enough that it couldn't be a coincidence. He looked toward the trees. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched, not hunted, not stalked, just noticed, settled in his gut like cold water. That evening, just before the last light drained from the sky, he went to fetch more kindling and saw the print. Near the wooden gate that led into the tree line, there in the soft earth still damp from the night frost, was a single boot mark, bigger than any foot in town, at least a size too large for even the sheriff. Deep, fresh. The tread pattern looked military, or at least expensive. Miles crouched next to it, heart skipping. Someone had been close, closer than they should have been, and they hadn't bothered to hide it. He came back into the house with hands full of wood and a silence thicker than usual. Hattie didn't look up from her mending, but her voice was low, and even when she spoke, "If you're keeping it," she said, never lifting her eyes from the thread, "then you need to know, kindness isn't free." Miles said nothing. He didn't need to. The fear in his chest had already paid part of the price. That night, sleep stayed far from him. The forest outside pulsed with quiet tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind through the chimney flue, felt like a message he couldn't quite translate. The goat shed, only 40 feet from his window, felt impossibly far, and yet too close. A secret you couldn't bury, not even in straw, somewhere past midnight. He heard it again. Not a knock, not footsteps. This time it was just the soft rustle of leaves in a pattern too careful to be the wind. A whisper of movement. Then nothing. He pressed his ear to the wall and waited. At dawn, he walked out to the shed and found everything still in place. The bottles were empty. The straw looked warmer. The creature, still curled and silent, had one hand resting on a smooth, flat rock that hadn't been there before. Miles picked it up. It was still warm, not from the sun, from something else, as if it had been held before being placed. The warmth of a palm. The kind of warmth that made a person pause. He didn't tell Hattie about the rock. He just set it gently beside the milk tin and backed away. But the way the little body relaxed, the way the breathing steadied just a little, told him everything he needed to know. Someone else knew the creature was here. Someone who wasn't trying to take it. Someone who understood the rules of exchange. Give something, receive something. No words. Just wait and warmth and silence. But the world wasn't only made of people like that. Near the gate, tucked into a shadow where no natural movement could have placed it, Miles found a snare. Wire, coiled low to the ground, tucked into the brambles. Not for deer, not for raccoons. Small, precise, set for something the size of a child. A trap that could disappear beneath a few fallen leaves. He knelt down, studying the twist of metal, the stake driven deep into the earth. His stomach turned. The wire was still clean. No blood, no hair. Not yet. Someone else knew too, but they weren't leaving gifts. That night, before the wind could rise, Hattie stepped out onto the porch with a hammer and a sign that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. She planted it in the ground near the front gate, right where the boot print had been. Red letters, faded but legible. Private property. No trespassing. She stood there a moment longer than she had to, one hand resting on the top of the post, the other wrapped tight in her shawl. Then she turned and walked inside without a word. Miles watched from the window, his hands curled around the curtain. His chest was tight with a feeling he didn't have a name for, something between dread and hope. The kind of feeling you get when you realize the story you're in isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to everyone watching from the dark, and they're not all watching for the same reason. The air stayed cold that night, colder than it should have been for early fall, and the wind didn't bring the scent of apples this time. It brought something sharper. Smoke, iron, pine tar. Inside the goat shed, the little one didn't sleep, just stared up at the slats in the roof where the moonlight filtered through, eyes glinting like damp stones. Miles sat beside it in the straw, holding the warm rock in one hand, listening to the silence stretch thin between the trees. And far off, deeper than the woods should go, a knock, 2 beats, too clean to be real. But not all that's false is fake, and not all that's quiet is safe. The fever came like a slow tide, rising and receding in waves that pulled Miles deeper into a state of helplessness he'd never felt before. It started with the creature going still for too long, its breathing thin and shallow like it had forgotten how. Then came the heat. Not warm like before, but wrong. The kind that clung to its skin and made the straw damp beneath its back. Miles had tried milk, then water, then tried just holding it. Nothing worked. Its eyelids fluttered without opening. Limbs twitched sometimes, but not with strength, more like sparks fizzling out. And each time the breathing thinned, Miles found himself frozen, watching for movement, afraid he'd already lost something he barely had time to hold. Outside, the air had turned sharp again. Cold settled fast this year. The sky pressed low, heavy with clouds the color of unwashed wool. Every step between the goat shed and the kitchen felt longer now, like the space had stretched. Miles tried not to cry. He wasn't sure if he was more scared of it dying or of what it meant if it lived and someone took it. By mid-morning, he'd sat on the packed dirt floor of the shed for hours, whispering things he couldn't explain. Not prayers, not really words, just fragments of thought, hopes he didn't know how to form. The fever didn't break. At some point, he stumbled into the house, pale and quiet. And Hattie didn't ask what was wrong. She watched him for a moment, eyes unreadable, then turned without speaking and walked to the back pantry. From the top shelf, behind an old mason jar of buttons and a faded bag of mothballs, she pulled out a small metal tin, square and dented with time. She placed it gently on the kitchen table and opened it with both thumbs like cracking a locket. Inside were dried leaves and brittle roots, things Miles couldn't name, but felt were older than most memories. She ran one finger through the contents, then looked at him, steady and dry-eyed. "Lil ones get fevers," she said. "Same way they get born too early. You don't leave 'em to burn." Then she handed him a pinch of pale bark, a sprig of something that smelled bitter, and told him how to boil water without scalding the medicine. It took 20 minutes to steep. Miles kept checking the fire, rocking on his heels like motion could speed things up. When it was ready, she poured the dark liquid into a chipped mug and handed it to him wrapped in an old kitchen towel. "Don't let it sit," she said. "And don't let none of it spill." He didn't ask what was in it. Back in the shed, the creature lay motionless, limbs curled in on themselves like sticks after frost. Miles cradled the back of its head and trickled the tea into the corner of its mouth. Most of it dribbled out again, but some went down. He kept going, drop by drop. After a while, it gave a weak cough, a rattling sound that scared him more than silence. But it swallowed after that. Then again. And again. By late afternoon, the fever hadn't broken, but the color of its breath changed. Less gray, more present. Miles pulled the straw tighter around its body, placed the stone back beneath its curled hand, and just watched. That was when he saw it. The edge of the sack had shifted, and in the faint light filtering through the slats above, Miles caught the shape of its face, not in glimpses this time, but whole. The matted hair had parted slightly near the brow, revealing pale skin beneath, not white like his own, but the soft tone of something never touched by sun, stretched across a brow shaped more like a boy's than a beast's. The nose wasn't animal. It was flat, wide, like some of the kids he'd seen in old family photos from Hattie's attic, native maybe, or just old mountain blood. Its eyes opened slowly then, glistening amber, catching the afternoon light like pieces of resin. Not glassy, not dumb. Miles felt a chill crawl up his spine as the creature looked at him. Not past him, not through him, but into him. It blinked once, then again, and its hand, shaking, reached out, brushing his wrist in the same soft way it had that first night. That's when he noticed the blood. Not fresh, just a faint streak dried across the twine he'd used to close the old sack. He picked it up gently, confused. The twine wasn't his, or at least, not this piece. This one was thinner, stained, and knotted in a way he hadn't seen before. It had been added, replaced. Someone had come close enough to touch it, to mark it, maybe even to leave a trail. The knot wasn't careless. It looked deliberate, like it had been meant as a sign or a question. He set the twine aside and stepped out into the fading light. That night, Miles barely spoke. At dinner, he pushed food around his plate and nodded when Hattie mentioned the storm rolling in. He didn't tell her about the twine. He didn't tell her he'd seen eyes that weren't animal, or that when the baby looked at him, it was like being chosen. She didn't ask. Later, when the sky turned black and the wind picked up over the ridge, she came to his room with an old wool blanket and told him he might want to sleep in clothes tonight, just in case. Then she left without closing the door. Sometime after midnight, Miles heard the engine. Slow, careful, tires rolling over gravel in a rhythm that matched no delivery or neighbor or friend. Then a pause, silence, a door opening, then nothing. He sat up in bed, heart hammering, then slipped out and padded barefoot to the hall window. The trees beyond the yard swayed gently in the wind, but he could see a shape, tall, still, beside the edge of the gate. No flashlight, no movement, just standing, waiting. Then came the sound, a soft scrape, metal sliding against wood. He froze, listened. Down by the goat shed, something tapped the wall. Then another sound, like a blade easing between slats. Gentle, testing. A slow pressure prying at the space where the boards met. Miles backed away, one step at a time. At the foot of the stairs, Hattie was already waiting. Her boots were on. She held a flashlight in one hand, and in the other, a pot of steaming water fresh off the stove. She didn't speak, just nodded toward the back door and walked out, shoulders squared like someone walking into a courtroom. Miles followed behind her, blood pounding in his ears. The man was there, tall, broad-shouldered, His parka hood was up, but Miles could see the glint of something in his hand. A long flashlight, or a pipe, or worse. Hattie didn't flinch. She let the water spill just enough to splash her hand and dropped the pot with a sound like a bell cracking. He startled, not from fear, but from being seen. She cursed loud enough to cover Miles' footsteps as the boy slipped around the house and ducked behind the root cellar. The goat shed door was still shut, but the latch had been lifted. Opened. Not broken, just left ajar. Like someone had looked and decided not to finish, or like someone had been interrupted. Inside, the creature was awake again. Barely, but it blinked when he touched its shoulder. He scooped it up with both arms and ran. The wind tore at him as he crossed the yard. The trees moaned overhead. He didn't think. He didn't look back. He just moved. Toward the old potato cellar, the one Hattie had sealed years ago but never filled in. The door creaked, but the hinges held. He ducked inside, kicked it shut, and bolted it with a rusted latch. It smelled of soil and time. The walls were damp, but it was safe, or felt like it. The creature pressed its head into his shirt, eyes closed again, body trembling. He cradled it close, heart still racing. He couldn't hear anything outside. No footsteps, no voices, just the storm building over the ridge. But in that darkness, beneath layers of earth and roots, Miles felt something shift. The air, the silence, the space, like someone was moving above them. Or worse, below. His hand found the back wall without thinking, fingers brushing along the stone and wood until he hit a seam, a line he hadn't noticed before. A door, not one he'd known about. A second exit, hidden. The baby clung tighter, and above them, a new sound echoed through the timbers. The whistle. Not the one from before. This one was broken. Off-beat. Like someone trying to copy something they didn't understand. But not everyone outside was guessing, and not everything out there was human. Not anymore. The sign on the corkboard by the checkout counter was new. Thumbtacked right below the Sunday church potluck flyer, between a lost cat and a free firewood listing. Miles spotted it the second he walked into Bridger's general store, and his whole chest went tight. The paper was off-white, edges crisp like it hadn't been there long. No logo, no signature, just one bold sentence, block letters too clean to be local. Cash reward for any proof of large primates in Vermont woodlands. And under it, a number. No name, just digits. When he read it, it didn't sound like a voice on the other end. It sounded like an answering machine in a trailer with the shades drawn. His eyes kept going back to the words as he stood in line with 2 cans of condensed milk and a pack of gauze Hattie had scribbled on the list. He could feel someone watching him, even though he didn't turn around. He just held his breath and counted the clicks of the register. 1, 2, 3. Need twine? The man behind him asked. The voice was low, almost pleasant, except it wasn't. Miles turned slowly. The man was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing a gray parka too clean for someone who worked outside. In his basket, a roll of steel wire, a coil of new twine, 2 packs of galvanized nails. He smiled like a person who had nothing to hide. Heard folks out near Thatcher Hollow still do fences by hand. Hard to find good cedar slats, huh? Miles didn't answer. Just paid in cash and walked out. But the cold on his neck wasn't from the wind. That voice, it wasn't the same as the night whisper by the shed, but close enough to shake something loose in his memory. Same timbre. Same pause between words. When he got home, the yard felt off. Too quiet. No birds, no wind. No sound of Hattie humming inside. He cut around the house to the back like always and froze halfway. The goat shed door was open. Not wide, just enough to let the cold in. The latch had been scraped sideways, splinters fresh on the frame. Inside, straw was scattered like a fight had broken out. The tin bowl was kicked over, the little blanket gone. And the creature, gone. Miles didn't breathe. His whole body just went still, like the air had thickened around him. His boots moved before his brain did, crunching through dead leaves and pine needles as he followed the faintest trail past the shed. He didn't call out. That would be stupid. Instead, he crouched low, eyes scanning every foot of earth for something. A scuff mark, a drip of blood, a tuft of dark fur. And there it was, a tiny smear, rust-colored. Not fresh, but not dry. Then another, near the split in the fence, and a third, on the edge of a rock that marked the old creek path. Miles followed the creek bed without thinking, ducking branches, slipping on moss. His heart felt too loud. After maybe 20 yards, the trail faded. But there, nestled in the shadow of an old maple with roots like fingers gripping the soil, was something strange. Not a trap, not bait, a braid. It wasn't rope. It was grass, dry and flat, woven carefully into a pattern that didn't look modern. Indigenous, maybe, or just old. 3 strands looped over once, tied with a knot that sat like a question mark. It wasn't dropped. It had been placed. Someone else had been here, but they hadn't taken. They'd left something behind. Miles looked up. The branches above him shifted slightly, not from wind, but from weight. He didn't see anything, but he felt it. Further downstream, hidden beneath the lip of the bank, he found the bundle. It was wedged in tight between the roots, cold but alive, shivering, eyes half-lidded. The creature's tiny fingers were clenched around a lump of wet bark, like it had tried to hold on when it fell. Miles dropped to his knees and pulled it close, checking for bruises, for broken bones. But all he found was mud, scraped palms, and a familiar smell of damp straw and something musky that wasn't quite animal. It hadn't been dragged. It had been carried, then placed, and now returned. Back at the house, Hattie met him at the porch with the lamp already lit. She didn't ask where he'd been. She just looked at the thing in his arms, wrapped now in a torn flannel, and sighed low through her nose like a woman who's seen enough strange in her life to know when more is coming. Inside, she laid out a clean towel on the hearth and poured warm water into a metal basin. Miles knelt and started washing the mud from the creature's face, his movements slow, careful, the way you touch something sacred. And for the first time, the child, because now there was no denying it was a child, opened its mouth not to cry, not to speak, but to breathe in a way that sounded almost relieved. Its lips were cracked. Its face, beneath the fine matted fur, was flushed from cold. But those amber eyes were open, focused, and they found his like they knew him. That night after the fire died and the wind picked up, Miles stood by the window looking out across the field. That's when he saw the same gray parka. It stood near the edge of the tree line, close enough to be seen in silhouette. Not moving, not shivering, just watching the house. Miles didn't tell Hattie, but the next morning she placed a long wooden pole by the back door. Nailed to it was a board she hadn't touched in years. The paint was faded but still legible. Private property, no trespassing. She carried it out without speaking, drove it deep into the earth with the back of an old hatchet. Then she stepped back and stared at it for a long time before turning around. Her hand brushed the edge of her coat, where she kept the old hunting knife she used to use on coyotes. She didn't speak for the rest of the morning, but when Miles brought in wood later that afternoon, there was a second tin bowl next to the hearth, and beside it, wrapped in cloth, a small jar of honey with a note that said only, "If it comes back cold again, warm the inside first." That evening, as he sat by the fire, the child asleep beside him with its tiny fingers curled around the warm stone like a talisman, Miles heard the sound again, out past the fence line. Wood knocking, once, twice, but this time, a third knock followed. Slower, off, not quite right. Miles stood and pressed his palm to the glass. Somebody was trying to mimic the forest, and doing a bad job of it. But the forest wasn't fooled, and neither was he. Somewhere out there, the watchers had started watching back. Not all of them with eyes that knew kindness. Some of them only saw dollars and evidence, and something small enough to fit in a cage. The child shifted in its sleep, curling closer to the heat, and Miles knew in his chest what he hadn't dared say out loud. This wasn't over. And next time, they wouldn't come at night. They'd come in daylight, with paper, with proof, with traps too quiet to hear until they snapped. He stepped back from the window, heart drumming, the last echo of that third knock still ringing in the hollows of his ribs. And for the first time, he knew this wasn't just about keeping something hidden. It was about keeping something safe, even if that meant choosing a side, even if that meant losing everything else. The house creaked. The fire hissed low. Outside, the trees shifted again, not with wind, but with something walking between them. By the second night, the pattern was clear. The food left out near the back fence, plain, unseasoned, wrapped in cloth instead of foil, disappeared quietly. No scraps, no torn fabric, no tracks that led anywhere. Just gone. And in its place, always something strange and silent. The first time, it was a flat stone that still held the heat of a hand, though the ground was already frosting over. The second night, a leaf bundle tied with thin strands of animal hair, placed carefully like a folded note. No message, but the meaning was loud in its stillness. Miles didn't touch the gifts at first. He left them out overnight, checking again each morning to see if they'd moved. They never did, just sat there waiting, like a quiet nod in the dark, saying, "We see you. We know." It was Hattie who finally picked up the stone, held it between her palms, eyes unreadable, then set it on the kitchen windowsill without a word. Miles didn't ask what she thought. He just watched her hands. They looked older when they were still. She spent the next morning sewing cloth wraps with thick cotton thread. Said nothing, but she handed him a small bundle of cornbread and dried apple, and nodded toward the fence again. "Don't leave anything they'd smell as human," she muttered. "No soap, no meat, no grease, only clean." Miles understood. Not just because of her words, but because of the fear that lived underneath them. It was the kind of fear that didn't raise its voice, the kind that had learned to survive by staying quiet. That night, the exchange happened again. The child, because Miles had stopped thinking of it as a creature, was growing stronger. Still small, still shaky on its feet, but it could now stand with its back to the shed wall and drink water from his hands without spilling. Its eyes followed him when he moved. Its fingers grasped the blanket tighter in sleep. And the stone, that warm, flat one left the night before, had an odd effect. When placed near its chest, the child stopped shivering. Its breathing settled. Miles didn't understand how warmth could be shared like that, but the stillness it gave was real. But not every visitor came to give. That night, when the house had gone dark and the wind carried a sharper bite, Miles stepped out to check the fence line. He moved with a flashlight low to the ground, careful not to shine toward the woods. That was one of Hattie's rules. Don't flash light into eyes you can't see. Near the gate, just beneath a cluster of dead ferns, he saw it. A trap. Wire thin, carefully coiled. Not a hunter's snare. Too small for deer, too precise for anything clumsy. This wasn't for food. This was meant to catch something delicate, something child-sized. His stomach dropped. It hadn't been there yesterday. He crouched, careful not to breathe too loud, and studied the wire. It was fresh, shiny. The soil around the anchor pin had been disturbed with a knife. Smooth cuts, not dug by hand. Miles felt the breath go tight in his chest. Someone had been back. After the gift was taken, after the stone was left, someone had come not to trade, but to take. And they were getting smarter. He snapped the wire with a branch and buried the pieces under the frost-hardened leaves. His fingers were numb by the time he stood. The moon was rising fast, a dull silver disk above the ridge, casting long shadows across the field. And then he heard it, the knock. 2 short taps, but not from the same place, not from the woods. from the direction of the old tool shed near the back lot. Too close, too exact. Someone was mimicking. Miles didn't move. He just listened. The taps came again, but this time slower. Off rhythm. Wrong. Whoever was out there thought they understood the code. They didn't. Inside, Hattie had already lit the oil lamp. She was standing by the door, one hand holding a weathered board. She looked at him as he stepped in, the wind curling through the cracked wood behind him. Her voice was low. "Get the sign." The sign had been hanging in the cellar since before he was born. Painted in red over a white board, the corners chewed by mice, but the words still loud. Private property. No trespassing. Hattie had sworn she'd never use it. Said once that putting it up was like inviting violence, like naming the fear out loud. But tonight, she hammered it into the soil beside the driveway with 4 solid blows and left it standing like a warning bell. That should have been the end of it. But the air didn't settle. It only grew colder. That night, the first frost came hard. Ice rimmed the edge of the goat shed window. Miles had bundled the child tight in quilts, with the warm stone tucked close to its chest. He sat on a stool nearby, not sleeping, not even pretending. Sometime after midnight, he heard footsteps outside the wall. Not boots, softer, measured. He held his breath. Then, light. A flash, bright and quick, like the click of an old camera bulb. The window glowed for a second, then darkened. Whoever it was had tried to take a picture. He knew that sound. He'd heard it once at the county fair, when tourists took Polaroids of the petting zoo. Miles stood, heart pounding, and peeked through the slats. Nothing but trees and fog. He moved fast, kicked dirt over the shed floor, threw the blanket over the hay, lifted the child into his arms and backed out the rear door just as a second light cut through the bushes. This one moved. A flashlight. Someone was circling. Inside the house, Hattie moved like she'd been waiting. She crossed the kitchen in silence, grabbed the kettle off the stove, and poured steaming water onto her own hand. The scream was real, loud enough to cut through the trees. Miles bolted for the corn silo, heart thudding. The child pressed close to his chest. The cellar was near, an old root bunker built into the slope behind the barn. He yanked the latch, ducked inside, and slammed the door behind him. Inside, it was damp and close. Earth-packed walls, wood beams crusted with salt. The child whimpered softly, curling tighter in his arms. Then he heard it. Outside the far wall, something scratched. A slow drag, then a click. Another latch. Miles spun. There, half buried in the dirt, was a second door. He hadn't known it was there. No one had used it in years. But someone knew. Someone else had remembered. The child's tiny hand gripped his jacket, and from outside, through the cracks in the slats, came a sound that didn't belong. Not the knock, not the whistle. Something else. Breath, heavy, too close. Then a pause, and from the ridge far above, a long cry answered. Not a voice, but not animal either. Miles held still, heart in his throat, waiting for the second knock. It never came, only silence. And the dark pressing in, full of things unsaid. He didn't sleep. And when morning came, the frost hadn't melted, not even in the sun. And that, somehow, was worse than anything. The frost didn't melt the next day, not even by noon, not even where the sun touched. It clung to the porch railings and the roof slates like something half alive. Miles woke to the sharp burn of it in his lungs just from stepping out. A thin sheet of ice spreading across the water bucket like a window someone forgot to close. Hattie didn't comment on the weather. She just filled the kettle, laid out rags on the stove to warm, and handed him a mug of honey water like they were both bracing for something neither could name. Out in the shed, the child had started standing. Not well. It trembled with the effort, leaning against the wall with knees bent and spine curled. But it stood. Miles watched it from the corner as he refilled the basin. It had learned to brace itself by touch, mapping the uneven walls with one hand while the other stayed pressed to the warmth of the flat stone. Each time its feet shifted, They left small prints in the hay, wide-toed and not quite human, but not anything else either. When the wind hit just right through the cracks in the boards, the creature would flinch. Its ears, small, soft-edged things that sat low and hidden beneath the fringe of hair, would twitch like a rabbit's, and its gaze would lift, searching through the slats toward something only it could hear. Miles didn't speak during those moments. He didn't need to. Something about the way it moved said, "I remember that sound, and it hurts." The light had started thinning by late afternoon when the first sign came. Not footsteps, not knocking. A flicker, a sharp burst of white along the edge of the fence. Flashbulb bright. Miles ducked behind the woodpile fast, but he'd seen enough to know. Someone was taking pictures. He stayed crouched, heart pounding in his ears. Another flash followed, then a pause, then one more. Whoever it was, they were circling, working slow. He backed toward the house in silence. At the door, Hattie was already waiting with the kettle in hand. Not boiling, not steaming, just warm. She met his eyes for a breath, then tilted her wrist and let it spill. Not a scream this time, but enough to make the metal hit the floor with a clatter loud enough to carry. A distraction. Miles didn't need a second cue. He ran. Out the side, across the patch of gravel behind the old barn, feet pounding the frozen ground. He didn't even stop at the shed, just yanked the door open and swept the child into his arms. It cried out in surprise, but didn't fight. By now it knew. When he moved fast like this, it meant danger. The cellar beneath the corn bin had always been his hiding place. He and his cousin used to sneak down there to stash comics and jerky. But now, as he heaved open the hatch and stepped into the earth's throat, it felt different. Not safe, just buried. He latched the door behind him and moved into the dark, breathing hard. The child clutched tight against his chest. It was silent for a while, dust shifting, roots creaking overhead. Then a sound, faint, but close. The side door, the one he hadn't known about until last night. It had shifted again. He held his breath and pressed his ear to the wall. Nothing. Just wind outside, or maybe the rustle of brush. But then came the unmistakable snap of something brushing the frame. Not breaking in. Just testing. A pause. Then silence. He backed away, inch by inch. The child stirred in his arms and let out a small whimper. Not fear, just confusion. That's when the cry came. Not from nearby, from the ridge. A sound like a woman calling through her teeth, low and long and broken in the middle. It echoed down the trees, rolling across the snow-glazed field like something cold enough to cut. And then another sound followed, closer, a call in response, but not from a voice. From a throat too wide, too deep. The child pressed its face into Miles's jacket and whimpered again. Outside, something moved. Fast. Branches snapped. Not like someone walking, but like something passing through without needing paths. And then silence. He waited there until the cold crept through his boots and the tips of his fingers began to go numb. The child had fallen asleep in his arms, breath shallow but steady. Its skin beneath the fur was warm again. Not fevered, just alive. Later, when the moon had risen and the air stilled, Miles slipped back out. The yard looked untouched, but he knew better. In the snow near the gate, 2 sets of tracks. 1, boots, large, deep tread, the kind you'd get from tactical gear. The other, bare, wider at the toe, lighter in pressure, but unmistakably bipedal. They'd crossed each other near the fence, close enough to see one another, and then parted in different directions. Miles crouched beside the prints, studying them until his knees ached. The boot prints had retreated fast, turned sharp like someone had changed their mind. But the bare ones had lingered, turned toward the house, paused, then faded into the woods. He didn't speak about it when he went back inside. Hattie was sitting in her chair, a bandage around her hand, cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. She didn't ask what he'd seen. She didn't have to, but she did reach over and slide a matchbook across the table. old, from a bar that had closed a decade ago. Inside, 4 matches left. She lit one, held it close to her face, watched the flame flicker. "You're not the only one who's seen him," she said. "But you might be the first one they've ever brought something back to." He sat beside her in silence. The child was curled in the blanket near the fire, chest rising slow and even. He could feel something shifting in the air, not just the cold, a tension, like the forest was waiting to see what they'd do next. And somewhere out there, someone was waiting too. Not the ones who left stones, the others. The ones who set snares small enough for something not yet grown. And now they had a picture, and probably more than one. Miles leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, breath fogging up in the chill. He didn't know how much time they had left, but he knew, deep in his chest, that it wouldn't be enough. Not if they stayed. Not if they kept waiting for the next flash, or the next wrong knock, or the next whisper trying to sound like kindness. Some decisions don't come all at once. They arrive slowly, like snow building on a branch, until the weight becomes too much. And then it falls. Quiet. Clean. Final. And when it does, no one really hears it. But everyone knows it happened. The sound came again, softer this time. Metal brushing wood, slow and careful like someone trying not to be heard. Miles didn't breathe. He crouched low in the root cellar, both arms wrapped tight around the child, his spine pressed to the back wall. His legs were starting to cramp, but he didn't move. The old wood of the cellar door had swollen from the cold, warping in its frame, and every little creak above sounded sharper underground, like it was happening inside his own chest. Something shifted outside. Then stillness, a kind of stillness that wasn't natural. Not air waiting to move, not snow falling quiet. This stillness had breath, had intention. Miles leaned his head toward the corner, toward the wall that had once held crates of potatoes during the war, before the far side caved in and it got sealed off. He pressed his hand flat against the dirt-caked boards, followed the uneven seam by touch. The hidden exit was real. He'd seen it with his own eyes now, half buried behind old stonework, where the frost didn't quite reach and the air tasted like tin. It hadn't been used in years, maybe decades, but tonight it was more than a secret. It was a door that might still open. He shifted the child gently. It didn't wake, just turned its face into his jacket, breath soft and fogging up the wool. Its hands were curled tight again, the way they always did when it slept, one of them still holding the stone like it had grown there. The little body was warm, not burning, not cold, just alive. That was all Miles could ask for anymore. Outside, the footsteps came back, heavier now. Someone was walking slow, maybe trying to listen through the boards. Miles could hear the sound of something metal being set down. Then that voice again, low and too close. Not a full word, just a breath with shape. A latch clicked. The old cellar door flexed against the bolt. Not hard, just enough to test it. Then came the sound of fabric brushing wood and footsteps moving off again. Miles waited, counted all the way to 60. Then again, the child stirred slightly, shifting in his lap. Miles touched its shoulder, steady and quiet, and turned back toward the old wall. The frame of the hidden door was tight with roots. His fingers found the spot he'd seen last time, a notch where the panel had split years ago. He pressed hard. Nothing moved. Then again, with his shoulder. The wood groaned, soft but real. He pushed again. It gave. Beyond it was a dark tunnel barely taller than his knees. Damp earth, old stones, roots hanging like spider legs. The kind of crawl space only a desperate person would enter. Right now, Miles was that person. He pulled the child close to his chest and began to slide through, dragging his boots behind him to muffle the sound. The air got colder fast, wet and mineral, like old caves near the creek. Somewhere above, wind brushed the trees, but down here the only thing that moved was breath. His, theirs. The tunnel twisted once, then rose slightly. He followed it with one elbow pressed into the dirt. the other hand shielding the child's head. His heart pounded. Every inch felt like a mile. And then, light. Not much. Just a thread of silver sneaking through a crack ahead. He squinted toward it, eyes burning from the cold. It was a gap in the stone where frost had crept through, carving a line down the moss. And beside it, a handle. Rusty, frozen, but real. He turned it. The door groaned as it opened. Not loud, but loud enough to make his ribs tense. He ducked out, boots first, into an old storm shaft lined with half-rotted beams. The ground here sloped downhill fast, leading to the gully that ran behind the cornfield. Trees stood bare above it, black veins against the sky. Behind him, no sound, no footsteps yet. He ran, not fast, not loud, just enough to put space between him and the door. The child clung tight, half awake now, head turning toward the trees like it was listening for something else. Miles cut through the edge of the corn rows, what was left of them. Dry husks and frozen soil cracking underfoot. He crouched near the rise and looked back. The cellar door had been opened, only part way, but enough to know someone had gone in. He kept moving. The gully behind the property was deeper than it looked. At the bottom, ice had formed a thin skin over the runoff. He found the old fence line again, the one that hadn't been maintained in years, half buried in leaves. Just past it, the woods thickened fast, and the shadows went from silver to black. He paused there, crouching low beside an old cedar stump, and pressed his hand against the child's back. It looked up at him, amber eyes blinking slow, mud on its cheek, snow caught in its lashes, and something else, an understanding. Miles didn't know where that came from. It wasn't just the look. It was the silence between them. The way its hand rose and pressed to his chest once, then dropped again. Then the footsteps came. Not far. Behind. Fast. He turned and saw light sweeping the woods, flickering through the trees in wide, fast arcs. Someone had a flashlight now, moving quickly, too close. Miles didn't think. He moved up the embankment, boots sliding on wet leaves, hand gripping the frozen brush. The child tucked against him like it knew this mattered. At the top of the ridge, he ducked into a hollow behind a stone wall that had once been a fence, now collapsed into moss and memory. Then, noise from below. A voice. Close. Don't move. Miles froze. The voice wasn't shouting. It didn't need to. He heard the click, metal against metal, a rifle being readied. But then, something else answered. A sound from the woods. Not a man, not a coyote. A voice too deep to echo right. Too wide to be thrown by wind. A call that didn't belong in the human world. It rolled through the ridge like a storm cloud with teeth, and it made the men hesitate. That pause saved them, because from the far side of the woods, another shadow moved. Larger, slower, blocking moonlight. Not close, just visible, just present. The rifle didn't fire. The flashlight blinked twice, then went out, and footsteps turned, faster now. Back down the slope, back into the dark. Miles didn't move. Not for a long time. The child was still pressed to his chest. The stone in its hand was glowing faintly again, maybe from warmth, maybe just from being held. Then came the quiet knock. Not wood, not stone, something hollow. 3 times, from somewhere behind them. Not threatening, not rushed, just there. Miles turned his head. He didn't see anything, but the sound stayed. He pressed his face to the child's hair, breathing in its smell, earth, leaves, firewood, milk. He didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside him bent hard. A place that had stayed upright too long finally gave a little. And that was the moment he knew. They wouldn't get another chance. Tomorrow was the line. If they didn't leave now, tonight, there wouldn't be a way out that didn't end in chains. Photographs and questions nobody could answer without killing something innocent. He looked up at the ridge, toward Burnt Cedar. The sky was starting to pale, and behind them, somewhere in the trees, the forest waited. Not to hide, not to hurt, but to receive. To take back what had been stolen, or maybe what had wandered too far. Miles stood slowly, shifted the child to his back, its arms around his neck. Then he began walking, not fast, not afraid, but with purpose. Because now, the only thing that mattered was getting to the top before the light gave them away, and hoping, just once, that something old and wordless would meet them there and understand. The ground crunched beneath his boots with each step, a thin shell of frost splintering over frozen leaves, loud in the quiet way only early morning cold could be. Miles didn't stop moving. He couldn't. The ridge was still half a mile ahead, the sky paling just enough to make silhouettes lose their edges. Behind him, the shadows of trees stretched longer than they should have. The child clung to his back, arms draped over his shoulders, chin pressed against the worn collar of his jacket, its breathing warm against the side of his neck. The heat of that breath was the only thing anchoring him to the moment, to this strange truth he was now part of. He kept his eyes forward. Burnt Cedar Ridge was just beginning to glow with the first light, the kind that wasn't sunlight yet but knew it was coming. The bare branches caught it like brittle fingers, trembling in the hush before dawn. Miles didn't know if anyone was following, but he didn't look back. He knew better now. In the woods, looking back could make a sound louder, could make a silence mean something. At the top of the slope, just before the clearing, he paused. Not from fear, just from the weight of it all. His legs ached. His hands were numb. But more than that, he felt the end pressing in on him from every side. Not in a way that meant death. Something else. The end of being a boy. The end of belonging only to himself. He stepped into the clearing. The wind up here was colder, even sharper than in the valley. But it moved gentler. More like breath than force. Burnt Cedar Ridge looked different now. The trees barer, the earth dusted in white. The rocks slick with the night's freeze. There were no birds, no sound. Just the soft rasp of wind and the steady thump of his heart in his ears. He crouched by the center tree, the tallest one, the one shaped like a crooked finger pointing toward nothing, and unfastened the child from his back. It didn't fight him, didn't cling, just slid down slow, knees bent, feet planted. It stood on its own now, shaky but firm, and looked up at him with that wide, knowing gaze. Its face had changed over the weeks. Not drastically, but enough. The fur on its cheeks had thinned. The short beard along its jaw had grown into the fur at its neck. But what stood out most were the eyes. Deep amber, too full for a creature that couldn't speak, and the pale skin that showed beneath the fine hair of its brow and nose. There was a humanity in it now that no one could explain away. Miles knelt beside it, reached for its hand. It didn't take his. Instead, it stepped forward on its own, into the center of the clearing, then stopped, and the woods moved. Not loudly, not in a way that broke the quiet. They just shifted, a low crackle of ice, a bend of brush. And then, across the clearing, something emerged. At first, only a shadow. Taller than any man, wide-shouldered, with fur that looked darker than night, matted by the cold and streaked with time. It didn't rush. It didn't pause. It simply stepped out of the tree line and stood, watching. The child turned toward it slowly, and Miles saw something change in its face. Relief, recognition. Not joy, not fear, just that soft, gut-deep knowing you feel when you're finally where you're meant to be. The big one didn't make a sound. Its face was almost still, but the eyes, deep amber too, rimmed in white, sharp with age and memory, locked onto the child and didn't move. It raised one arm, slow, palm open, an invitation. Miles didn't move, but his breath hitched, because behind him, the sound he feared most, a snap of branches, boots on frost, fast. He turned his head and saw them. Two men, rifles low but ready, cutting through the trees like they'd been hunting more than a trail. No words, just presence. and purpose. The first lifted a camera, snapped, then again. The child turned, startled by the flash, and Miles saw its face twist, not with fear, but confusion, like it didn't understand how something so small could feel so loud. Then Hattie's voice rang out behind them. "Don't move." It wasn't loud. It wasn't screamed, but it landed like a hammer. She stood at the edge of the ridge, wrapped in her long coat, hand bandaged, holding the final gift, the last stone they'd left by the fence. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the tree, at the clearing, at the child. Then she stepped forward and placed the stone on the frozen grass. Just one step in, then backed away. No one spoke. Not the hunters. Not the old one in the trees. And then the child turned back, looked at Miles. Not with longing, not with sadness, just with grace. And it stepped forward. 1 foot, then another. Its arms loose by its side, head held steady. And as it crossed into the line between light and shadow, the big one met it, bent slightly, and laid one hand on its shoulder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The way the hand lingered, gentle but strong, said more than any word could. And just like that, they turned and walked back into the forest. No sound, no farewell, just silence folding in around them like a curtain drawn slow. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The 2 men stood frozen, unsure. One raised his rifle, hesitating. And that's when the siren came. A sheriff's cruiser, just a mile down the lower road. Whooped once. Short, sharp. Enough to crack through every false intention like a whip. Enough to remind everyone that laws still existed. Even out here, even when no one could see them. The men turned, backed away. One still snapping photos as he went, but hurried now, sloppy. The trees swallowed them fast, and the cold returned. Hattie let out a breath she'd been holding for too long. Miles sat back hard, knees weak. His hands were empty now, and yet they had never held more. The clearing was still, empty but not hollow. The prints in the frost were already fading. By sunrise, they'd be gone. But the weight of what had passed through here wouldn't melt so easily. They walked home in silence. The house was warm when they stepped inside, but it felt different. Like something had been lifted, or maybe just returned. Miles stood by the kitchen window as Hattie poured water for tea. She didn't speak. She just placed a second mug beside his and left the sugar tin open. Out the window, the trees moved again, not from wind, but from memory. Something bigger than them had moved through this place, and part of it had stayed. Later that morning, Miles returned to the shed. The blanket still lay where he'd left it. The basin was empty, but the warm stone, the very first gift, had been placed on the windowsill. Clean, still warm, and beneath it, in the dust, a mark. 3 lines, bent into each other like fingers holding hands. Not carved, just drawn, like someone knew he'd return, and wanted to say, "You did right, and we remember." He stood there a long time, just breathing. Then he smiled. Not wide, not proud, just enough to feel the frost finally melt behind his ribs. And somewhere far in the trees, deep past where the light could follow, something stepped gently across the snow and didn't leave a sound. But it left everything else. Some stories aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be felt, slowly, deeply, in the quiet places of the heart where logic can't reach. Because sometimes the most powerful things don't arrive with thunder or answers. They come in silence, in the shape of a small life saved, in a hand held through the cold, in the choice to protect something no one else sees the value in. There are moments in life when we're faced with a truth no one else is watching, and in that moment, we decide what kind of person we really are. Not because we say the right thing, but because we do the kind thing. And kindness, real, quiet, unshakable kindness, doesn't need an audience. It echoes in the dark anyway. It plants itself in the soil of who we are and grows there, long after the moment has passed. There's a kind of courage that doesn't shout. It doesn't come wearing medals or chasing glory. It comes in the form of staying, of choosing not to run, of wrapping your arms around something small, fragile, misunderstood, and saying, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." That's the kind of bravery that reshapes the world. Not all at once, not for everyone, but for the one who needed it most. And sometimes that's enough. Because in a world too often built on fear, cruelty, and profit, there's still something sacred about the ones who choose love without condition. The ones who stand between what's hunted and what's human. The ones who don't need proof to believe something deserves to live. We won't always understand what we're given in this life, but maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe the point is to honor it, even when it doesn't make sense. Especially when it doesn't make sense. Because the best parts of being human have never been about answers. They've been about empathy, about memory, about connection. Sometimes what we protect ends up protecting us. Sometimes what we let go leaves something behind. And sometimes the smallest act, a bowl of warm milk, a door left open, a silence respected, becomes the beginning of a legacy that no one can erase. Thank you for listening. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you feel a little more, or remember something you'd almost forgotten, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, how this story moved you, or simply say hello. And if you believe in stories that matter, stories built on compassion, mystery, and quiet courage, please consider subscribing and joining this growing circle of people who still care. Because the world needs more listeners, more keepers of the old stories, and maybe, more than ever, more protectors of the invisible. Take care, and wherever you are, stay kind.